My name is Rashawn Ray, and for the Conceptual Essay Project, I did a paper critically examining Charles Fried's Contract as Promise, a theory of contractual obligation, and his views pertaining to the current contract laws. So Charles Fried is an advocate for the classical theory, right? He essentially rejects the modern theory. So he even created his own model called the promise principle, which is rooted in the foundations of the classical theory, saying that individuals have autonomy to make promises and they voluntarily enter into promises or contracts, and then they are morally obligated to substantially perform those promises or that contract. Again, he rejects the theory of the modern theory, especially taking a strong stance against doctrines such as consideration. As we know now in modern contract law, that's one of the three biggest elements, or one of the three elements to have a valid offer or enforceable contract. So he argues that the doctrine of consideration, it distorts some of the moral obligations and also adds external factors to a promise that's not necessary. Such as, we talked in depth about the Hamer versus Sidway case, about an uncle who promised $5,000 to his nephew if he were to abstain from certain activities which he was legally entitled to do. When the uncle died and it came time to pay the money to the nephew, it had to go through all these extra hurdles, going to court to argue for consideration, when it was simply a voluntary promise made to the nephew by the uncle. They had to go through all these extra hurdles to try to get him the money that he was entitled to. So after that, he takes another strong stance against certain remedies. So out of the three remedies, expectation, reliance, and restitution, he believes the only fair remedy is expectation. Because if a party made a voluntary promise to another individual, they are expecting to have that promise fully performed. So he believes that if this comes down to a court situation, expectation damage is the only fair. He also says that if you can't prove necessarily the value of the expectation, then reliance is the next best. But he really only accepts the expectation damages. That is essentially what my entire paper is about. I go into a little more detail about how he rejects the modern theory and the Grant Gilmore's, the collectivists who are leading the shift from the classical to the modern theory. He envisions that the only way to essentially, not saying that the contract law is bad, but he envisions that in the future, the contract law will revert back to some of the classical foundations that they had, that contract law will give some of the autonomy and the self-will and the voluntary aspect back to the individuals, so we can essentially get rid of some of the hurdles, such as in the Hamer versus Sidway case, to enforce some simple promises.